It's almost a universally accepted fact that the Beatles are the most influential group in pop music, with their music and appeal transcending class, nationality, colour, age, gender and more. But whilst their popularity in the so-called free world is well examined, the influence of the Beatles on the other side of the Iron Curtain is less well known. So today, we'll have a look at how the Beatles influenced the youth of the Soviet Union and the rest of the Eastern Bloc, inspiring an appetite for change and hope in the youth of the USSR. But why would the Beatles inspire this change? Why had this not happened before John, Paul, George and Ringo? To answer this question, three key factors must be examined. Firstly, the cultural enormity of the Beatles in the West, and how dramatically they surpassed the influence of any of their contemporaries or anyone who had come before them. Secondly, the impact of Soviet popular music within the Soviet Union, and how that impacted the youth. And lastly, how previous Western musical acts had been received in the Eastern Bloc. The first point is rather easy to address. The Beatles' influence eclipsed anyone that came before them. Lennon-McCartney, the most successful songwriting partnership of all time, the stadium gig was invented to support their immense crowds, and they were the biggest stars of our world, the first ever global live television broadcast in 1967. And perhaps most impressively, on the 4th of April 1964, they occupied all of the top 5 spots on the Billboard Hot 100, something that has never been achieved since. There has never been, and likely never will be again, any entertainment act with the cultural enormity of the Beatles, making them the perfect candidate to drive a thought revolution in the Soviet youth. The question of why a Western act was the one to drive this change is a more complex one. Terry Bright argues that it was a matter of logistics, saying that getting instruments, learning musical techniques, and finding places to rehearse and perform in were the inhibiting factors. However, even if this infrastructure was in place, it could almost never have been a Soviet group driving this influence in the youth, as the nature of rebellion against a system like the Soviets innately means supporting foreign art, as any art with significant cultural influence was subject to intense scrutiny, as to either conform to the heavily favoured and formally official style of socialist realism, or simply censored or slated in official publications. To answer why it was the Fab Four that drove this change, rather than any of the previous icons of musical rebellion, such as Chuck Berry or most notably Elvis Presley, the political and social context of this time in the Soviet Union must be examined. The Harvard project in 1950 of the views of former Soviet citizens showed that the younger generation actually approved of much of what the Soviet Union was doing, with the notable exception of collective farms. Archie Brown writes that in the 50s, the freedom young Soviet citizens wanted was quite basic, showing the appetite for rebellion was not there yet. Catherine Merridale's 1945 study of letters from Red Army soldiers found that though they did desire a more lively cultural life, none demanded democracy, let alone Stalin's skull, with pride over the war victory lasting well into the 1950s. However, the repressiveness of Stalin's regime can also not be ignored. Stalin died in 1953, and Khrushchev's secret speech denouncing Stalinism wasn't until 1956, 2 years after Elvis released his debut single. So the appetite for rebellion wasn't allowed to brew until a mere few years before Beatlemania would really kick off in 1963. Since I've now hopefully answered the question on why the Beatles were the musicians to drive the Soviet rock and roll revolution rather than any other band, now the question is posed of how it happened, what the impact of the Beatles on the Soviet youth was, and how it changed the face of Soviet popular culture for the rest of the Union's existence. The extent that young Russians went to in order to be able to listen to the Beatles is staggering. In his article Beatles for Sale, Pavel Aksanov describes a thriving trade in bootleg discs produced in the USSR and Eastern Europe. This developing black market music, and specifically of Beatles albums, will put buyers and sellers at huge risk, not only of their expensive music being taken and destroyed. English-speaking vinyls could cost up to 70 rubles, but also potential firing from work or expulsion from school or university. Journalist Andrei Legudkov says he bought a tape of Sgt. Pepper's, funded by a week of skipping school breakfast, literally starving himself to hear the music of the Beatles. Putin's close aide and former Deputy Prime Minister Sergei Ivanov has said that Beatlemania was so universal that it made the Soviet Union feel like any other European country. This goes to demonstrate the extreme lengths young Soviet citizens would go to get their fix of Western culture, as the two cultural moments of Stalin's era fading into history, as well as the rise of the biggest band in the world, collided. The officially approved music of the time was Russian folk music, the sound, fashion and energy of which failed to connect to the youth the same way the Beatles did. With Kolya Vasin considered Russia's greatest Beatles fan, who owns the John Lennon Temple of Love in St. Petersburg, saying that to him, the Beatles felt like spiritual brothers. But the Beatles weren't just a rock band in suits playing 4-chord tunes. By the mid-1960s, they had transformed into something much greater, with technical developments like looping being pioneered on 1966's Tomorrow Never Knows, and musical developments such as the mode mixing of Aeolian and Dorian on Eleanor Rigby. The culmination of this came in 1967 with Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, and the cultural phenomenon of the Summer of Love came along with it. Since the Summer of Love and the Beatles are inextricably linked, the Soviet hippie movement can be traced to the influence of the Beatles. Julianne First writes of the impact of the Beatles on the Soviet hippies. Excerpts from Western songs, especially Beatles songs, soon became guiding life slogans for hippie youth. The Knižka, a little pocketbook carried around by many hippies, which ad hoc drawings and thoughts were scribbled down, usually contained a great many of these quotes, in either English or in rudimentary translation, designed to serve as reminders of the emotion they had engendered when heard in their musical context. This quote perfectly highlights the DIY approach that the Beatles fans, or Beatlemani as they were known in Russia, from the X-ray records to the underground sing-along locations to these rudimentary translations. One of the great impacts of the Beatles is demonstrating the strength of the young spirit to rebel against an often repressive authority. Leningrad hippie and future aquarium founder Boris Grebenshchikov described this cultural moment as knowing that help had arrived, a different existence. If the raucous rock and roll of the early Beatles and the hippie-inspired Sgt. Pepper's era of the Beatles had resonated with the Russian youth, then their underground popularity was truly consolidated on the 22nd of November 1968 with the release of the White Album and the opening track, Back in the USSR. I'm back in the USSR. You know how lucky you are, boy. Of this song, the Beach Boys' Mike Love, whose influence can be plainly heard in the song's vocal harmonies, said that he suggested McCartney talk about the girls all around Russia, the Ukraine, and Georgia. Of course, the irony cannot be ignored that one of the Beatles' most Beach Boys-esque songs is about the USSR, the antithesis of the all-American Beach Boys. Although Ian MacDonald called the song a tactless jest in the face of the troubles in Czechoslovakia at the time, McCartney himself has referred to the song as a hand across the water to the Soviet people. When McCartney performed in Red Square in 2003 to an audience including Gorbachev and Putin, the crowd's ecstatic reaction to Back in the USSR perfectly highlights the continuing cultural impact of the song and the Beatles as a whole in Russia. Considering the unparalleled impact of the Beatles, their existence was very short. It was only a short 6.5 years between the release of their first album, Please Please Me, and their ultimate breakup in September 1969. In fact, George Harrison was only 26 years old at the time of this breakup. But the legacy and the impact of the Beatles has far outlasted their run as a band, and now I've hopefully established that the influence of the Beatles was of paramount importance in influencing the youth culture of the 1960s in the Soviet Union. The question remains of how the Beatles influenced that generation of young Russians when they grew up. Glasnost and Perestroika had an immense impact on pop music. For the first time, clubs were opened, and whilst Cliff Richard had toured the USSR in 1976, a foreign, live music presence really began to exist. Walter Gerald Moss describes this time as the first time that rock music could really be considered mainstream in the Soviet Union. Even the more controversial side of popular music was beginning to show in Russia, with reggae bands openly using marijuana on stage just a stone's throw from Lenin's mausoleum in Red Square. I would argue that this would never have been possible without the impact of the Beatles in the 1960s, and the political circumstances pushed the rock explosion in Russia into the 1980s rather than the 1960s and 70s, as was in the West, but the influence of the Beatles had not diminished in this time. Thus far, this video has largely focused on the Russian SFSR, and that makes sense. It was the political base of the Soviet Union, and the largest and most populous of the Soviet Socialist republics. But how did Western popular music, and specifically the Beatles, impact non-Russian parts of the Eastern Bloc? The cultural life in the young Lithuanian city of Kaunas may provide part of the answer to this. Remaining over 80% ethnically Lithuanian, with the majority of others being Poles, ethnic Russian influence remained lower in Lithuania than their Baltic neighbours. Amanda Swain writes that listening to rock music did indeed become a pursuit that drew young people out of the orbit of official recreational activities in Lithuania, and it makes sense that this desire for rebellion would be just as strong, if not stronger, in a country that was essentially being ruled from a foreign capital. In Ukraine, the influence of the Beatles was also great. In 1974, Andrei Vadi wrote in his diary of English as the tongue of the Beatles. He had only been 8 or 9 years old when Sgt. Pepper's was released, already showing the influence of the Beatles passing on to the next generation of Ukrainian youth. Sergei Zhuk wrote that the popularity of the Beatles triggered interest in other forms of rock music and fashions, directly attributing the influence of the Beatles to the changing face of Ukrainian youth culture. These examples from Lithuania and Ukraine show that the Beatles' influence was not confined to Russia, and more specifically Moscow and Leningrad, during the final few decades of the Soviet Union, but spread far and wide throughout the Eastern Bloc. I know this video has focused a lot more on the history side of music rather than the real in-depth theory side of it, but if you want to watch a video about the Beatles that goes really in-depth into the music theory, perhaps consider watching this video of mine on what I consider to be Paul McCartney's greatest love song, and thanks for watching.